selves. So now I have to say something decent. And so we take refuge in the Buddha as what is called in the Tibetan tradition a valid person. A valid person that has something to say that does not require blind belief, but that provides a reasoned belief. And we can develop our own conviction by simply reasoning. And so what is wrong in our perception is cannot sustain reasoning, but we can analyze that this can never possibly be the case, and to see for ourselves what the world would look like without that delusion. Buddha gives a sustained argument how our misperception of the world gives rise to our unfortunate behavior, which therefore is not our fault. And so that brings also me immediately to the second aspect of the Buddha, that he is compassionate in the sense of relieving us from feelings of guilt. And we are not bad people. No one is a bad person. Our mind is simply profoundly mistaken. And so, in that sense, the point of taking refuge in the Buddha is to be empowered by that refuge. And the Buddha basically says, you can become a Buddha as well. And I can explain you how to do that. And so he puts the ball back in our own court, as it were, but does in such a manner that it does not require anything in return, and is equally given to every sentient being. Of course, the deeper Dharma is that what he has to give. It's called true paths and true cessations. He gives a description what mind to develop and in what way that mind, the wisdom realizing emptiness, overcomes as the antidote to all of our problems. We grasp an inherent existence, as we will discuss in a moment. And the Buddha provides us with a description of which type of mind overcomes that unfortunate perception, and how it therefore cures our mind perpetually of its problem. And of the three, of the Dharma refuge, the one that we realize ourselves is the real refuge. We want to become an object of refuge, both to ourselves and to others. That is the real thing that we try to generate a conviction of when we take refuge. Here in our context, when we take refuge in the Sangha, what we really try to take refuge in are others that have already developed these true paths and true cessations. We need friends, in other words. I often use as an analogy that, as far as I know, the wheel has been invented in human history once, and that seems a pretty straightforward invention, that you can roll things forward. And that when it was introduced in Egypt in the 15th century BCE, it took them another 1,000 years to figure out that you could move stones by wheels. They just used them for warfare for another 1,000 years. So something that is that straightforward takes that long to invent oneself. And then it sort of suggests that figuring out how to become enlightened on our own would be unrealistic. Why would one want to do that if something is available? No, I don't need to invent a car. I can buy one. There's no point to inventing it. And so in the same way, it would be, on the one hand, unlikely that we would discover enlightenment just on our own accord, in contrast to many Western ideas. And on the other hand, why would one want to discover it on one's own when one can just read upon it? One can read up upon it. And so that is, on the one hand, the purpose of taking refuge, to generate that mind, the mindfulness of what we are aiming at and what source we want to get it from. On the other hand, and that elaborates with all the other aspects of the prayers that we do in a moment, is the understanding that all things in this world are non-self. So our intent is not self. We have no absolute control over our intent. Our intent is a conditioned phenomenon. And so to just want to be able to do things is never going to work. And we all know that. We're all old enough to have figured out that if we want the mind to behave in a certain way, if we want the mind to engage in academic studies or whatever you have, that's simply trying to force the point is a losing game. The mind performs a certain function when there are the right conditions for it to do so, in this case, motivation. And so the second reason why we recite prayers is to generate a deep motivation to remind ourselves, like, what are we trying to accomplish? Like, what am I setting out to do? Why is that important? And so therefore, especially at the most basic reason in the Buddhist context why we would want to attain enlightenment, of course, is the fact that which is badly translated as suffering. In fact, I will argue in a moment that of the three types of what is the Sanskrit word is that we often translate as suffering, the latter we would not even recognize as such. And so the primary target, of course, as you know, is dukkha. And dukkha, which has as an etymology an axle in a wheel that is badly connected, like a car which the front wheels are not aligned. So you can drive, but it feels profoundly uncomfortable, to say the least. And that sense of apprehension, of being unnerving, being stressful, that is the real meaning of this term dukkha. I also sometimes use the word friction, which also in some context works quite well. And so of these three types of dukkha that we seek freedom of, the first one is, of course, suffering. We have latent suffering. We're born is suffering. No baby comes into this world thinking like, I'm glad to be here. But the first thing that we are even required to do is cry. And that on the one hand is to learn to breathe on our own, but also because the way down is not pleasant. And then we come into this world and we completely, as you are very aware of, for the first few years, you're completely incapable of doing anything at all. And then bit by bit, we start to grow old, we become infirm, and we will have to die. And in the middle, there's all kinds of problems that we have. The Buddha says that is, in a way, superficial, that is at the surface level, but there's things that are far more profound and all pervasive that we struggle with than just suffering. Suffering is bad enough. But underlying, there's two things that are much worse. And so he says the second thing that is, on the one hand, that is much more pervasive and much worse, but also a major source of the apparent suffering is our great sense of dissatisfaction. We are all like drug addicts, always seeking satisfaction, but in fact, the very means by which we seek satisfaction is also the cause of our dissatisfaction. We seek things outside. And so we are dependent, and our dependency creates the very discontent that we try to satisfy. And so we seek not only relief from rebirth with all its consequences, we seek also an end to our dissatisfaction. And therefore, the Buddha says that the highest form of happiness is content, is in fact the ending of desire. Because it says, when you look at your own life, that is what you really seek. And because if desire would be desirable, you would never buy anything again, wouldn't it? And then you would maintain your desire. If a desire for a cup of coffee arises in you and think like, this is a good idea, I would never buy a cup of coffee. I would desire it until the rest of my life because I would have been satisfied. But in reality, the moment desire arises in the mind, a great discomfort has arisen in the mind. And so we've all tried. Sometimes you can't satisfy your desire, so you have to live with it. It is profoundly uncomfortable. And I think we all have enough memories of moments where we, in the end, satisfied our desire because our desire was even by ourselves experienced as a burden. And the Buddha says, when you look deeply, you realize very quickly that desire is always a burden. But desire is so pervasive that it is almost what is called an omnipresent mental factor. It's almost an aspect of the mind that is constantly present to us. So we are just being driven by an endless discontent. And so without ending that, there cannot be the satisfaction that we seek. Then the Buddha says that is not even the worst of the three. The other, the deeper one is called, with a pretty non-descriptive description. Yeah, this is happening again. Yeah. The all-pervasive compounded suffering, that tells you nothing at all. But basically it means is that, as I highlighted at the beginning, our intent is not free. We don't move from moment to moment and from life to life freely. We do so because we're impelled. We're impelled by karma. We're impelled by habitual patterning. And above all, we are compelled by our own ignorance. And we pursue the appearance of things that is unrealistic. And the Buddha says that is the real problem. The other two are the consequences of that foundational problem. And so that's when we take refuge, that is very important to reflect upon, because otherwise it becomes empty words. And I find that very often, that's the problem with our minds. They become used to things very quickly. And we recite these Tibetan things, and as though that has the power in and of itself, but it doesn't. And so the power of prayer in this case only works when we remind ourselves, like, I actually really have a problem. My mind is not a refuge to myself. I don't know what my mind will do in the next moment. At the moment, my mind seems well behaved, but we all know that the mind can turn against us in no time. I remember one of my first meditation teachers said, the mind is in a way like a snake. And when everything goes well, it seems to talk to your to your advantage. Yeah. Short night and a long day. Habit the moment, so it rattles on all the time, like a rattlesnake. But when you look at your mind, blah, 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 an endless stream of commentary. And we indulge in it. It's really unpleasant when you see it directly. So our mind is so dull, it sort of passes by. Habit, we sort of accept it when the rattling on is reasonably amusing. But the moment we encounter a problem in our lives, it turns itself against us. And then we call it depression. Because now this rattling on is about you in a negative sense. You are now bad. You have never succeeded. You have never lived up to anyone's expectation, and so on and so forth. And more deeply than that, in moments where we need the mind to protect ourselves, we often find that it doesn't. And when we have great conflict, or when we feel very vulnerable, or in the end, when we're going to die, we have no idea what our mind will do. And will our mind be nice and calm and spacious and protective, or will it go haywire? How to know? And that's quite something to consider, that you don't know what your mind will do. You don't know if your mind will serve you when you need it to serve you or not. And the Buddha said that is unacceptable. Not the mind's fault. The mind doesn't know any better. But it is important. Therefore, to train the mind in life like this is unacceptable. We are living in sort of like a divine realm, but look around in most of the rest of the world. And most beings suffer incredibly. Well, this is not a pleasure palace. Well, our little corner of it is a pleasure palace, but yesterday I was talking to Marie Odile about this specific neighborhood. And this neighborhood is not a pleasure palace. And many women here have to prostitute to make ends meet. That's not their choice. It's not because they're bad. That's because they need to put bread on the table. And in some cases, it's the only option you have. Now that it's harsh. And so to live in such a world in such a way is unacceptable. But in this context, the Buddha highlights that we have one more problem. So we have the problem of ignorance, afflictive emotions, and the karma that impel us to behave and to continue in time in unfortunate ways. He says there's one more big problem, and that we will elaborate a lot on today. He says, when we explore how we exist, and we find that we are dependently arisen. This is the other side. And so when we start to practice and bit by bit get a sense of who we are, how we operate, how we abide, we come to see that we depend on not some living beings, but on all of them. From the hell realms to the God realms and everything in between, we are interdependent arising. As the Buddha says, all beings are like our mothers. The most beautiful mind that we can generate is a love and compassion for our fellow sentient beings because they are our creators. He says once we discover that, then we find it very hard to actually care for them because our mind does something on the basis of our misunderstanding, something quite unpleasant when you make it explicit, and that this is always preoccupied with itself. Our mind has a consistent, when you look at the content of your own mind, it's me, endless self-identity stories going on and on, so profoundly preoccupied with itself that it is actually really unpleasant. If you would put that on the table, if you would share that with others, that would be pretty embarrassing. The Buddha says it is not only to our detriment, because our ignorance with regard to the self and our prioritizing of ourselves run around each other in circles. They are best friends. It also keeps us stuck to our ignorance. So we have already an ignorance, but now we have an obsession thinking about it as well. So we have a misunderstanding of who we are, and we are very obsessed with that our notion. That is like having poison and not being able to let go of it. To be compelled to think about it all the time. It's like when, and we all know this, like when you have a major problem in your life, like a conflict. Hey, you would love some relief of thinking about it. And when you have a deep conflict, you would think like, no, I shall sit at this for a moment and I shall not think about it anymore. You can't. Because your mind just goes round and round and round and round. It will not let go. And that is just a side effect, a symptom of that self-cherishing. And that we do all the time. And so we have a central problem, but on top of that, a mind that is obsessed about that problem to begin with. So these two go around in circles. And we said that is the contemporary problem that it creates. But in the long run, what it does also is to prohibit us from becoming Buddhas. This is so difficult to overcome that of the three types of enlightened persons, the first two, the Arhats and the Pratyeka Buddhas, actually can't overcome it. And so these Pratyeka Buddhas and Arhats are profoundly caring and compassionate beings. And it is said, as we talked about yesterday a bit, when they become awakened, they have what one could call like a sadness. Because now they have immeasurable love and compassion, but they also realize that they don't have the understanding to really care. So they would like to enact the well-being of others, but they don't often know how. And the Pali Sutras, you see that on a regular basis where the Buddha calls his primary disciple Shariputra to him, and where he says, I see that you try to care of your disciples, but that is not the way to go about it. And so Shariputra runs over and over and over into his limitations of knowledge and stuff. And so our prioritizing of ourselves makes the world non-transparent, even to Arhats, which is interesting. So they know how things exist, but out of meditation, the appearance remains the same. The self-prioritizing aspect of the mind hindered them from fully deploying their wisdom. So once they become awakened, they are free of suffering, but they're not free to enact the welfare of others. And that, of course, is quite disappointing. And so the Buddha said, when we take refuge in this context, following His Holiness the Dalai Lama, these are the two main reasons why we seek refuge. This is the great motivation for our practice. Like to overcome what is called afflictive obscurations, also the ignorance at the basis of all the unfortunate behavior of the mind. And at the same time, we like to overcome knowledge obscurations. If we accept that we are interdependently existing beings, then the best way to care for ourselves is to care for others. Because we don't know how. And so, with that in mind, I would like to recite the refuge prayers. And I will prefer to do in English. We do the short one. But I obviously have a lot to say today. And time is not on my side, I find. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness in the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering in the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. That's it?
No, pretty sure.
That's everything prepared then. Okay. That's the shortest prayers I've ever seen. It's almost Zen. They use less prayers, but they take a lot of time to recite them. So we should have done that. Maybe we should have asked Regina to recite them very slowly.
Mindfully.
Mindfully, indeed. I find it interesting. The most Zen traditions indeed prefer to do little but slow, and somehow all the Tibetan traditions like to do lots and fast. I remember when I was studying in Sera Monastery, that they were doing the Guru Puja every fortnight so fast that I could not keep up with the Tibetan text. And the Tibetan text also, they don't have like paragraphs or anything. It's like blocks of sentences, and then never says nowhere where you should repeat anything, for one thing. So this is like pages of letters, and they recite in high speed through that, and then yeah, I got lost a lot in the beginning. So for one thing, I see a few faces that I don't know yet. If I say anything that you think like, what on earth is he talking about, feel free to ask questions. Are you familiar with the Dharma?
Yeah, I practice my Sangha, so I don't take it again.
Then I can happily talk away.
Sorry?
Then I can happily talk away.
Thanks.
Yeah, you? Yeah. You had it about the name? Then let's go for it just. Yeah. But if anything doesn't make sense, let me know. So on the one hand, I think I should say this. Always try to find a middle way on the one hand by showing something of the depth of the text and at the same time making it as contemporary as possible. But there's always a bit of a choice, obviously. But I have seen. It's not that easy. Yeah. Yeah, but we might always hit on something that that not immediately makes sense. The also text of our text, Langri Tangpa, is one of the great Kadampa masters. The Kadampa tradition is for the specific, the Gelug tradition, very important. Because the Kadampa tradition are as the name for the followers of the great master Atisha, that created all the great new translation lineages as Kagyu, Sakya, and Gelug. He's the grandfather in a way, to some extent, all of them, but especially the Gelug see themselves as their successors. And the thing about Atisha is that had a beautiful story that Atisha was already a great master in India, traveled around widely, studied around widely, but despite his enormous intellectual understanding, he had very great difficulty, and that is very recognizable, I think, to many Westerners. He had great difficulty generating what is called a great compassionate heart. And we live in a society where feelings are deprecated often. In the Enlightenment period, feelings were considered to be feminine and unreliable. It was intellectual understanding that we thought there was logic where our freedom lay. From any Indian tradition in general, and from the Mahāyāna Buddhist tradition in specific, it does not make any sense. We have all studied that according to Buddhist phenomenology, the way our experience works, the main aspect of our experience actually is feeling. We feel the world above all before we understand. It also makes sense in a very important way because any moment of our experience is way too complicated intellectually. Had to reason oneself through in order to act upon it. And so we primarily act upon our feelings as like a sort of like a shortcut of a summary of our experience. Our mind tries to tell us something basic about our experience to act upon before it provides us with the intellectual understanding of what that experience is all about. And so in terms of discernment in every moment of experience, there is not a whole lot there. So we respond primarily to the felt sense of our experience. And so in a general sense, as meditators and practitioners of the Dharma, to learn to feel our way around is very important. It's also interesting that increasingly in Western philosophy, I wanted to use a name, and the name I see, and the name running away. You're not going to mention me now. Anyway, at one point I hope to organize a retreat with a propounder of that tradition. But what I wanted to say, like even in the Western tradition, there's increasingly interest in what the felt sense of the world does to us, what that actually is and what that means. For those of you that were with me in the intercontemplative retreat last year, anyone there of you? I worked with a philosopher, Donata Schiller, a Swiss philosopher that focuses very strongly on the felt sense of the world and how our felt sense both is created by our mind, but also forms the basis of that creation. So as the engine of our world creation, as it were. Okay. And so even from a Buddhist perspective, that felt sense is very important. But it is obviously not new that it can be hard for some practitioners to reach, especially for men in a Western culture. And I found that amongst my own meditators, that is often the greatest challenge to work with is the development of a deep mindfulness of the way the world feels rather than on the things of the world. Also. The felt sense, yeah, how it feels. Yeah. So in Buddhism, the felt sense then to elaborate a little bit on it, is an aspect of what we call mind. So a moment of experience is a constructed phenomena according to the Buddha. And so one of the constructing functions of the mind, one could say, is feeling. And so the basic feeling is that every moment of experience feels either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And to the untrained mind, it just automatically generates aversion, desire, and indifference, respectively. On that basis, on these three basic modalities of feeling, and we have a whole range that elaborate and nuance that feeling. And so with aversion, we can have hatred and belligerence and so on and so forth. And on the pleasant side, we have attachment and desire and so on and so forth. So the nuance, the felt sense of our reality. And our mind, according to the Buddha, our intent follows primarily the felt sense. And so if something is felt as pleasant, desire almost immediately arises to have more of the same thing. And if aversion arises, then the mind tries to get rid of it almost instantaneously. So it shows that the felt sense is the generator, is the main component that conditions our intent. Our intent follows the felt sense of the world. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that would be a good introduction. Make sense? Yeah. what is here to highlight, now that we're talking about this anyway, is that the way we discern the world is also, does it say this? The way we discern the world is that the mind discerns the world in coherence with the way it feels. So if we have a disagreeable sense with regard to a certain person, our mind is also inclined to highlight aspects of that person's face, for example, that accord with our felt interpretation. So if I have a negative feeling with regard to someone, my mind will try to interpret that person's face according to my felt sense. And so the way we make contact with the world, the way our mind discerns the world, and the way our mind makes the world felt are in accordance with each other. And these are karmically driven. This has nothing to do with the world. It's the way our mind paints the world to us. And so the great master Atisha had difficulty generating what is called great compassion and bodhicitta. So great compassion is, on the one hand, to keep it as simple, a wish to alleviate all suffering from all living beings, using suffering at the moment as a shortcut with the word dukkha that we just talked about. And bodhicitta, the wish to become a welfare in order to accomplish that. That I guess you're familiar with. The mind of awakening shall become a Buddha for the sake of all sentient beings. And so we had heard the word a lot, understood the word, but he could not feel it. And as we all know, when we don't feel it, when an understanding is only intellectual, the mind doesn't follow. And we all have our 1st of January resolutions where we have brilliant intellectual ideas of the amount of sports that we are going to do, for example, and that we're going to quit smoking and never going to drink again. And then the 2nd of January, somehow this fails to deliver. And that is because our intellectual understanding is profoundly superficial. It's not the main vehicle that our mind uses to navigate the world. But if you feel a strong need or urgency to do these things, and when on the 1st of January you feel that you really have a physical problem, for example, but that really starts to hamper you in your well-being. So when there's a sense of urgency, then your intent is all too willing to follow. And so that is the problem Atisha had. So we understood the mind of awakening, the desire to become, longing to become a Buddha for the welfare of all living beings, but could not feel it. And when you can't feel it, the mind doesn't pursue it. And so then you have to reflect on it, but nothing much happens. No, the effect of it lasts as long as you were discerning it, and then the moment you let go of it, its effects are gone. Back to our 1st January resolution. And so that means when you don't have that, you have no, what is called a path to awakening. A path to awakening is where this urgency to become Buddha is always present with you. It is always influencing your mind. And so now in our case, our mind's intentions are all over the show. One moment you think, oh, Buddha would be a nice idea. Netflix, we're watching Netflix also. Our minds are profoundly scattered, but our intent is scattered with it. And so it is difficult for our mind to pursue something because it doesn't know how to choose. It has no focus, it has no great drive. To become awakened, you need quite a bit of drive. And so that undercuts the power of our mind. Our minds are profoundly weak because of that dispersion. And so, on the other hand, what we call a bodhisattva is someone who has this urgency perpetually in his awareness. So all moments of mind are informed by the single drive. That is the sort of, you could say, the best of 1st of January resolutions. It's a resolution that is so powerful that it accompanies you even from life to life. You don't even lose it when you take rebirth, when you have it. But when you are reborn, you're reborn again on a path. And your mind will pursue the same thing over and over. So therefore, of all the protective minds, of all the minds that are capable of protecting your intent, this is by far the best one. That keeps your mind together in this life. It makes that you accomplish everything accordingly in this life, but it will even transport you from life to life and keep you together. And so, put it in another modern term, it makes that you develop an ethical identity, one could say, that transports even from existence to existence. Yes.
Describe very, very clearly the faith in Buddha, which is needed. Always believe Jesus so strong that it's there.
Yeah, that's a matter of great debate, of course. We don't be the Tibetan tradition if we do not have some weight of it. But and I would like to keep this short, so if this doesn't make sense, let it go. Minimal view is Vipassana. But my personal opinion is that the minimal view is Yogacara.
It's about the view that asked about faith.
Yeah, the view of emptiness is important because that is really the object of faith in the Buddha.
Right, seeds.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yes. But that's a topic not for today, but I'm happy to discuss at one point. Yeah. I would advise most practitioners for that reason to heavily focus on Yogacara while developing bodhicitta. Because I think that pathway is for most of us more accessible than Madhyamika emptiness. But again, if I need to elaborate that, then the day is gone. Let's not do that. Yeah. Yeah, we can have that discussion over lunch.
Spend many years on that.
Well, you see many practitioners, for one thing, doing it, and that's the take up to took myself as well, because Yogacara emphasize the mind, and that the mind is a social construction. We are social constructors of the world, and so it takes a phenomenological perspective, which is very useful for emptiness or for bodhicitta. Anyway, think about it. Let's not make it that far. No, I don't remember where I was. Oh yeah, Atisha. So Atisha was going around India trying to find a teacher that could make him feel. Interestingly enough, and that would be a good hint, he hears of a teacher in Sumatra, in current Indonesia, Kai called Dharmakirti, or the Golden Isles, which is shortcutted by the Tibetans as Selimpa, at him of the Golden Islands. Yeah. And so there's a big book by Wisdom Experience called Lojong, and it tells the whole long story of Atisha's great journey across India, across the oceans. I think it took him 2 or 3 months to get there. So it was a harrowing journey. I mean, at that time, that was really the other side of the planet. It's like walking to Siberia and surviving. And especially his journey across the ocean is a bewildering story. But anyway, so he goes to Sumatra and meets there this great teacher who is a Yogacara master. And so there develops with his teacher over 12 years the mind of awakening and enters the bodhisattva grounds. He becomes someone perpetually seeking Buddhahood for the sake of all living beings. I tell the story because that story is foundational of the new translation traditions, especially the Gelug. Because it shows in Atisha's teachings and of the great Kadampa masters, this aspect, this pursuit of the mind of awakening takes central place. Everything else is subservient to the development of that mind. And you see that from Atisha and his Kadampa lineage produced many masters that wrote these extraordinary texts, and we have many of them. And that is really one of the highlights of the Tibetan literary tradition, or spiritual tradition. The amount of text on this topic of the mind of awakening is extraordinary. And without errors. And so these 8 verses of attitude training, as they are called here, but Langri Tangpa is one of the shorter ones. Many of them are much, much longer. And for those of you that are in that meditation training, we studied another one. It's interesting, called the 7 verses of my training. But although the number is lower, it's much longer and more complicated than this one. What I like about this one is that it is quite easily to apply when you know what it says. How are we doing in time, by the way? My alarm clock next to it, because otherwise I'll just end up talking and talking, and then it's midnight. We did it last night almost. Indeed, time goes quickly. Yeah. So the point of the text, of this text, is actually how to maintain that mind of awakening. So it takes for granted that you have already generated it. And so you have set your eyes on Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings. But in a broader sense, to be a bit more inclusive, we share this world with all living beings. We might take it from a Madhyamaka perspective or simply normal comprehension that we really depend on one another. And that when the way that we are currently destroying life around us will endanger us in the end, it becomes ever more apparent how important it is to cultivate the care for all other living beings. And then one could say this is an excellent training both of how to keep and train a compassionate mind and keeping yourself sane at the same time. And so one of the cruxes of this whole Lojo mind training tradition is to show that a compassionate, caring mind is both to our own benefit and to the benefit of others. That wants to highlight that in contrast to some Western ideas of altruism is not self-negating, although it sometimes sounds that way in Buddhism, but it's not. It is to our benefit. And that is the ultimate point of the mind of awakening as well. By seeking the freedom of all living beings, we will become by accident Buddha. Also, by only thinking about others, we will actually achieve our own aims. And that is an interesting proposition. I so think this text by Langri Tangpa has a few interesting clues that are very applicable in our normal lives, regardless of what your view and status, spiritual status at this moment really is. Regardless of where we are on our spiritual path, compassion matters. Although I don't like, by the way, the word compassion. Let's use the word care again. Compassion is a loaded word, which literally translates into suffering with, and it is not exactly the point here. And the point is to define it. Karuna is a mind one that seeks the alleviation of the suffering of others, and that without regard of the person. And so impartial and unconditional, does not seek anything in return. It's a freely given care. It's a care that is sufficient to itself. So far, that makes all sense? Good morning. Nijay. You practice your new name then. So to dive a bit into the text so that we don't get stuck on the introduction today, which is always a great risk. At least then I can say that I've done one verse. That's the minimum aim of today. Langri Tangpa says, may I always cherish all limited beings by considering how far superior they are to wish-granting gems for actualizing the supreme aim. This verse alone will be enough to explain the rest of the entire Dharma. But to start at the end, what is the supreme aim? The supreme aim, of course, is Buddhahood. The point of this tradition, the point of Langri Tangpa and the Kadampa masters, is to say our real aim is Buddhahood because it is the perfection of personhood. It is the perfection, the unfettering of what it means to be a person. We have all the potential qualities, but in our case, they are all limited. And that is why at the beginning of the verse it uses the word limited here. So our our care and our love and these things we do have, they are shackled. They're shackled by our grasping and inherent existence, are shackled by our anger and our belligerence and whatever you have, our desire and attachment. And so from that perspective, and when you remove all the hindrances, when you remove all the shackles, all the fetters, what you end up with is Buddha. And so when all the capacities of our mind are freed, then we have the perfection of personhood, and that is what we call Buddha, the awakened one, the individual to which no delusion remains anymore and whose capacities are free. And so when he says to cherish all limited beings, he highlights a number of different things. When we took refuge, when we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, it's often called taking refuge in the field of excellent qualities. Because these beings that we take refuge in have an unlimited knowledge and an unlimited care for all living beings. These are supreme in what they are capable of. But the Buddha argues, as we will see, as this text is going to argue, that this is not the only cause for our awakening, the only condition for our awakening. Another very important condition is the very presence of all living beings in manifold ways. And so, for different reasons, to keep it a bit simple, this is called the field of kindness. Sometimes it's split into two, but I don't like the split very much. So kindness in which ways? Well, kindness, for one thing, from a cosmological perspective. We have been reborn since the beginning of this time, and in an unlimited amount of time, anything that can happen will happen. And so all beings have been our mothers and have cared for us, and so on and so forth. Beautiful reasoning, but for most Westerners, pretty inaccessible. So let's take it more to a contemporary level. The contemporary level, the Buddha argues that when you try to reason how this moment of your existence is possible, when you reason long enough, you will find that it depends on every other sentient being. And there's not a single quality of you and of this moment that does not depend on others. My body was not made by me. There's none of my knowledge that was made by me just solely on my own. The language that I speak was obviously not made by me. That would have made massive edits. And so whatever quality I think of, both of myself and this very moment of my precious human rebirth that I have, I find others in which. Now, if I would take a moment to figure out, to reason through which beings this very moment depends on, my day would already be too short. And then I have only listed the ones that it directly depends on. Now it takes thousands of people to produce this laptop directly. It takes numerous people to produce the robes that I'm wearing, the food that I had this morning, and a cup of coffee that 2 cups of coffee, okay, that I had. So when you start to list all the people that at this moment directly depends on, this list is almost already endless. It contains tens upon tens of thousands of beings, if not hundreds of thousands. And each of them depends on someone else, on in fact, the same number. And so in a few steps, you have included every living being, in fact, that ever lived. And so we are and that's true for each living being. Each of us is, from our perspective, the pinnacle of the entire web of life. We depend on its support. And so the Buddha says, for that reason alone, they are beyond kind, because without them, this moment would not exist. Whatever that will be, we would not know, but it's not possible. So that's the second good reason to cherish them, why they are objects of our gratitude. But it says when you do aspire for Buddhahood, when you do aspire to set yourself free, then how would you do that without their help? I mean, how would we develop an immeasurable care without others? How would we develop wisdom, any of the qualities of our being, without the help of others? We could not develop immeasurable generosity without others. We could not develop patience without others. None of the perfections of Buddhahood would be feasible without the presence of others. So it's not only that we are here because of the kindness of all living beings, but the perfection of our personhood is only achievable by way of the kindness of others. And so for these three reasons, all living beings are our object of devotion as well, not only the awakened ones. And so he says, for that reason, they are like a wish-fulfilling jewel, because they will, by caring for them, we will meet all of our needs. All that we have ever sought will be attained in Buddhahood. That Buddhahood is only achievable because they are there. And so, what the Buddha does, I always say, in the Rice Seedling Sutra, the Buddha beautifully says here, because this is, that is, and if this were not, then that is not. The simple reasoning of dependent origination. And I always say the rest of Buddhism is commentary. Because in a way, it is fascinating to see that not only does this moment completely depend on others, there is no essence. That by caring for our conditions, we will achieve our own perfection. That's what is the pursuit of Buddhahood is the fulfillment of the argument of dependent origination. I rise in dependence on all living beings. And it is by pursuing the well-being of all my conditions in that way that I will find perfection. Because if I exist only in dependence on them, what else is there to do than to care for them? So it's a beautiful, natural argument for care for others, for the spiritual aim. Yes, Gendun.
We obviously experience the ripening of actions in the past. Okay. When we experience these things, must beings with worse karma suffer. So we experience. For example, the nice dinner. How many things? Therefore, even when you experience the good ripening of karma of the path or paths, other beings must suffer.
That doesn't follow.
Private path, for example.
That does not follow. Because suffering is simply there. It's not a required condition. How does it follow?
It's the farmer has to plow the field.
Yeah, but that is what we do. That it would not, I mean, that would be reasoning the other way around, because then you require that your karma ripens in the suffering of others in order for you to become Buddha. That's not the point. No. Yes. No, it's not only an individual thing either, but as well.
When Buddhas are in the world, does it cause less suffering than when an ordinary being is?
Yes, of course.
Why?
Because they don't harm as much as we do.
They must eat or appear to eat.
But these are good questions, but you go a little bit off the board with your questions. Because it goes way into metaphysical things. So when Buddhas say this, when really enlightened practitioners consume, for example, food that was produced by other living beings, they benefit them. Because they have a continuing prayer for their well-being. They construct karmic relationships.
Good idea to get to that state.
Yeah, exactly.
Choose not to is choosing suffering for others.
Say it again?
To choose not to go quick and to say, okay, I'll sit around for a bit.
Yes, exactly. That's my point, that we need
It's actually to choose suffering for others.
to choose suffering for others. How does that work?
Because you're choosing to be ordinary.
Oh, that way. Yes, of course.
Then
Yes.
that's not.
That's why you should become enlightened tomorrow, rather than the day after tomorrow.
Yes.
But as I said yesterday, yeah, so the answer is that exactly. Yeah, but again, it's yeah. I found a simple way to answer a very complicated question. Yeah, yeah, yes. But that's exactly the point of this whole tradition. That's why we practice Tantra. Tantra is a response to the question like, well, 3 countless eons is a nice argument, but that it becomes unacceptable. But the quicker, and actually, Robina Korten often says that. Well, if you really want to alleviate the suffering of others, then become enlightened tomorrow. Stop it. Because as long as we are not enlightened, we will harm in infinite ways. Yeah. But that's something to carry. It's inevitable. Walking around is harm. Yeah. Exactly. So the urgency there's a good reason why I go on and on and on and on and on and on and on about that we have to get on the Bodhisattva path in this life and not wait. That some of us really should make the effort to do it. Because I find that so far we're talking way too much for my taste. And no, we have His Holiness and Lama Zopa Rinpoche to show that it can be done. And the point is not for them to sit on pedestals and thrones. But I find often that we put our gurus just to keep them there. The point of a guru, the point of a manifestation of a Buddha, a text make very clear, is to show us that it can be done. Otherwise, why show us? Otherwise, they would hide it. Because it will be deflating to show quality that cannot be achieved. That would just be depressing. And so the fact that Rinpoche showed it shows that it can be done. That we should pursue it. And so that on the one hand, so they are precious in every possible sense. I find also the word limited here very important because it highlights again 2 things that are very important for care to really work. So we've already seen care works because we are dependent originations. We depend for our existence on that. But one thing that is implied here with regard to their side is that they are not bad in and of themselves. They equally, like us, don't have essence. They are also dependent origination. And so for one thing, they can change. Yeah? And that's very important to keep in mind because why generate compassion or care for someone that can't change? That would be useless. And it's not their fault. And so because our anger and our belligerence and so on and so forth are accusative, they're judgmental. And when we're angry with someone, what we are implying is that person is bad. And we take a contextual incident and we generalize it into someone's characteristic. We go from, in a moment, something unpleasant happened, to a generalization that is untrue, that this person is bad, and no one is. Yeah? You could not think of a single person in this world, even the greatest mass murderers, if you would be with them, you might have a good moment. I'm pretty sure if you could have lunch with Ho Chi Minh or Stalin or Hitler for that matter, it would be very plausible if you're on the good side of that person to have a most pleasant lunch. There were definitely people liking them. And so they were not unequivocally bad people. They did bad things because of certain conditions that made them behave in it. And that is why this word limited is important, so that we can remove that judgmentalism from them and understand these beings behave as we know ourselves from our own personal experience in unfortunate ways because they are impelled to do so. It's not their fault. And so in manifold ways, I need to relieve them from those conditions. That is to my own benefit, to theirs, and to everyone else's. If we could have alleviated the suffering of Stalin, maybe to finish on a little story that is harrowing and eye-opening at the same time in terms of what we can really do to make it a little bit more applicable. And some of you know the story again, but 2 years ago, I went to Gori in Georgia, and I was there invited to visit a woman that does a lot of for Armenian refugees. You know, when the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan broke out, enormous streams of refugees ran into Georgia, and this woman, almost on her own, has set up an amazing project to care for them. And so I went to visit her and have lunch with her. What I'd completely forgotten was that was the birth city of Stalin, and Mr. Djugashvili. Thinking about his real name would have reminded me of that fact. And then when I was having lunch with her, she said, "Would you like to visit the Stalin Museum?" And I was like the what? It's like going to Vienna and go and visit the Hitler Museum. That does such a thing exist? Exist? It was the weirdest place. I mean, it was still devotional, strangely enough, even though Georgia already separated itself from, in hard ways, from the Soviet Union. And so, I mean, I still remember standing there in the entranceway, and you could buy like a bag with the image of the young Stalin on it. He was quite a handsome man when he was younger. I was like, what? It's like having a bag with the image of the young Hitler when he was still a handsome soldier in the First World War with his red mustache. Like, why would I want to walk around with that? Anyway, the museum was, yeah, it's like an exposition of man's paradoxes, how lost we are. And it was horrifying in the way that it was like one celebration of Stalin, apart from one room in the cellar that was talking about the millions that died because of his action. He was a priest as well. He was a priest as well, yeah, on top of that. Yeah. And so, you know, that the endless halls, because it's a massive building, the endless halls of photos and paintings and furniture and pipes and clothes and whatever you have. And then one room in the cellar dedicated to his victims was like, what on earth am I doing? And then I walk outside, and you have like there's a beautiful park out at the back of the building. The building, the first floor overhangs the exit. And so you have this protected area underneath. And in that space, there was like a decrepit building standing. I was like, what's that? So I walk up to it, and it was Stalin's birth house. So he was born in a profoundly poor rural family, and it said on the plaque that he had been abused by his father. A young boy, sexually abused by his father, became angry and paranoid, and never healed. And all of a sudden you think like, you know, what if someone would have taken that young kid and said, you know, someone would have told him at age 10, it's okay. What's happened to you is bad. Let's end this. You know? And no one did. He just grew up angrier and angrier and angrier, and then found the communist movement as a way to voice his anger and to engage in fighting with the Bolsheviks. Just sought an outlet for his anger. But his anger was caused somewhere back in time. It could never be healed. It shows what we can do. That we will never, I would say like, my own version of this attitude is to be in the world in such a way that you know for sure by the end of your life that you will have benefited at least one single person, that you don't need to know who that is. We take all care of the little Stalins of this world. We will never know how much suffering we prevented by simply taking care maybe of a single young man somewhere. So it's worthwhile to consider, because that is also the way in which independent arising can be both harrowing but also enormously powerful. And so in that sense, the Buddha says beautifully, of Langri Tangpa here says that all sentient beings are superior to anything in this world for achieving our ultimate aim. It is by seeking their well-being, we will be Buddha. By becoming Buddhas, we will have achieved all of our own aim. And it's therefore you can let go of your self-obsession. When you think only of others as a by-effect, achieve everything that you were ever looking for. That we will explore after a couple. This coffee is a necessary condition for me talking. Yes, yeah. See you in a, what is it? Huh? Half an hour, isn't it? Oh. Yeah, half an hour. Yeah. Yeah, your belt again. There was a problem at the airport. I have so much fabric around my waist. I never pass through a scanner. They always want to check everything. Yeah, but it's just one large piece of cloth. So if they check too well, then they get to see more than they were aiming for. Now I have a rule that I cannot be a naked ascetic, so that wouldn't endanger my vows.
I think Rinpoche complained about that.
Yes.